Hello, my New Testament intro class students. I told you I wanted to make a short little video to kind of clarify a few more things about the Gospel of Matthew, as well as a few things that obviously apply to Mark and Luke as well, and the New Testament for that matter. Two things I wanted to emphasize because they're crucial. One is the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament, the way the New Testament writers use the Old Testament. I want to touch upon that. And then I want to touch upon a few more things specifically about Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem for the Passion Week and what led him to be crucified, seeing that more in a historical context. Because those two things are really important if you want to get a better grasp of the life of Jesus in the Gospels. Obviously, the earlier thing we talked about, I know I mentioned, is the whole idea, and it was in one of the assignments, the whole idea of the Jewish eschatological worldview and the Christian tweaking of the Jewish eschatological worldview, the kingdom of God, how it would come. We talked about that. You always have to keep that in mind. So, one of the things you see in Matthew is his presentation of Jesus as the truly Jewish Messiah, the son of David, son of Abraham, whose gospel will eventually go out to the Gentiles. And that's kind of a theme you see all throughout the gospel as well. Now, given that, one of the unique things about Matthew is how often he uses the Old Testament. You know, quoting Old Testament passages are fulfilled in various events of the life of Christ. So I wanted to just walk through a few to make sure we understand this. Already in the homework and the stuff we talked about, the genealogies, what's going on in there. But now, starting with Gabriel's coming to Joseph and telling Joseph to go ahead and take Mary as his wife, I want to quickly go through the various Old Testament passages that Matthew quotes, because I asked you to cite them a lot in your homework, and you're probably wondering why. With these Old Testament passages that Matthew is using, you have to have a better understanding of how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, how they view fulfilled prophecy. Now, if you're like me, growing up, you probably thought of it on a very simplistic level to where basically Matthew's quoting this passage in the Old Testament, and he's claiming that way back when, centuries and centuries ago, like 500, 600, 700 years ago, a prophet from back then made a prediction about Jesus, and that finally that prediction is coming true 700 years later, and it's all right there in the Old Testament. Why didn't the Jews see this? If that's your understanding of fulfilled prophecy, that's not the right understanding of fulfilled prophecy, because that's not what Matthew is doing. What Matthew is doing, he's not trying to claim that these Old Testament verses were like predictions made in advance. We're not talking like Nostradamus predictions. He's doing something different. He's trying to explain Jesus' messiahship and the nature of his gospel against the backdrop of the Old Testament story of Israel. In that sense, he is fulfilling what, Jesus is fulfilling what God has been doing all throughout his interactions with Israel. So, in order to fully understand basically what fulfilled prophecy means, I'm going to use a little illustration with this cup. I got this with lines specifically. Now, basically, if you know the Old Testament story, if you took the Old Testament class with me, you will understand that the way the Old Testament is laid out is basically this. Genesis 1 through 11 lays out the problem with humanity. And what is God going to do then to rectify the sin and death problem? Then starting in Genesis 3, there's the story of Abraham. And starting there, God makes a promise to Abraham that he's going to make his name great. He's going to make Abraham into a great nation, which would be Old Testament Israel. And through that nation, all nations would be blessed. So therefore, that's kind of like the blueprint of the Old Testament story. That's how God is going to eventually bless all nations and deal with sin and death. But it's, not clear exactly how he's going to do it from that point. So in this cup, pretend that each one of these lines represents another phase in God's actions with Old Testament Israel. This line could be Abraham. Then when he makes that Abraham's descendants into a great nation. That's the Mosaic covenant, Exodus. And then later on, the conquest going into with Joshua. Then later on, the establishment of the Davidic monarchy. He's going to use a monarch, that could be here. And then the exile happens. They get kicked out of the land here. But then there's prophecies that somehow God's going to bring Israel back, and through that, there will be the ultimate Exodus where God sends his Messiah to recreate everything. Everything will be awesome. That's the progression. So as you go through the Old Testament, you kind of see, here's some water, God fulfilling his promise to Abraham. So it starts off with him fulfilling his promise to Abraham, and Abraham's name is made great, and he has Isaac, and it's through Isaac, and then we go on through the Exodus, and eventually they go into Egypt, are enslaved, but then Moses brings them out and makes them into a great nation. God's filling up his plan. And then he eventually, later on, they go into the promised land from Joshua, they move on, he's going to use the Davidic covenant, then they go into exile, yada, yada, yada. And eventually, they're up to this point. So the Jews of Jesus' day are like seeing themselves as here. When is God going to fill the cup up? Make good on his promise to Abraham to bless all nations, to bring the Messiah, etc. So what Matthew is doing when he's saying all these Old Testament verses are fulfilled in Jesus, they're not just predicting Jesus. He's saying that now that Jesus has come, he has fulfilled God's purposes of Israel throughout the Old Testament. So therefore, what you want to do whenever you read a fulfilled prophecy passage in Matthew, you want to find that passage, read it in its original context, understand what's going on in there, and then look for how does that original context, how does Jesus fulfill that original context? Okay? So, for example, having said all that, when Gabriel goes to Joseph and says, take Mary as his wife, he quotes Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin will be with child, call him Emmanuel, that verse. Now, you go back to Isaiah 7, and that is said during a specific event in Israel's history, the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. That's a whole other thing we can't get into yet. But basically, it's roughly 750 BC. Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, is confronting King Ahaz, and because Ahaz is facing a threat to his reign. And Isaiah basically says to Ahaz, put your trust in Yahweh, and he will protect you from this threat. Ahaz basically says, I'm not going to put my trust in Yahweh. I'm going to call up Assyria, because they were like the big superpower of the time, and I'm going to ask them to help me. Now, because of that, Isaiah gets mad, and he says, you idiot! You're ticking God off. God's going to give you a sign. Behold, now the Hebrew word is Alma. The Alma is with child. She's going to give birth, and by the time that child is old enough to know right from wrong, Assyria is going to come in, destroy that threat you're having, but they're going to stay and they're going to, screw you over. And so it has it has a specific historical context. And if you look in Isaiah, the context of that Emmanuel child in Isaiah points to the fact that it's probably Ahaz's son, Hezekiah. And the full prophecy that you see in Isaiah 7 through 12 is by the time Hezekiah is born and is a young child, Assyria will come in and oppress Judah because of Ahaz's unfaithfulness. But by the time Hezekiah grows up, he will be faithful to Yahweh, and through his faithfulness, Yahweh is going to kick Assyria out. So Ahaz, unfaithfulness, Assyrian oppression, his son, the Emmanuel child, Hezekiah, faithfulness, liberation from Assyria. And so King Hezekiah, a Mashiach, a Messiah, God worked through his faithfulness to thwart foreign oppression. So when you see this in Matthew, Matthew is basically saying Jesus is the Messiah. He's the fulfillment of that. And so therefore he is like Hezekiah, but bigger. Hezekiah was faithful and God used him to free his people from Assyrian oppression. Jesus is the ultimate Messiah, and because he's going to be faithful, God's going to work through him to free us from satanic oppression, the old age. So Jesus is like that, but bigger. And in fact, that's every time, almost every time when you see this going on in Matthew's gospel, you see that. So you have that example. When you have, let's skip down here to Herod's slaughter of the innocents. A lot of you mentioned that. Well, actually, before that, when they flee and they go down into Egypt because of Herod, Matthew quotes Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I've called my son. He says that Jesus fulfilled that. Well, when you look at Hosea 11, initially in the original context, it's looking back on the Exodus. And Hosea is saying, back in the Exodus, God called the Hebrews out of Egypt like his son, but then they go to the promised land and they committed idolatry. If you read Hosea 11, that's what it is. It's not a prediction of anything. It's looking backward in their history. What does that have to do with Jesus? Matthew quotes that because he's saying Jesus is like Old Testament Israel in the fact that Old Testament Israel was God's son metaphorically as a nation. Jesus is God's son, but where they failed, he's going to succeed. He's going to stay faithful. In that sense, he fulfills Hosea 11:1. Then you have Herod's slaughter of the innocents. That is Jeremiah 31:15. And Jeremiah 31:15 is lamenting the slaughter of some of the Israelite sons, from the kingdom of Judah actually, during the Babylonian exile. And basically it's saying when Nebuchadnezzar comes to take many people away, the mothers will be crying. Rachel's crying for her children. That's what it's a reference to. Now, Matthew takes that and applies it here in a twist, because the shocker is, whereas in Jeremiah, it's the foreign oppressor Babylon who's taken away the kids and killing them. Here, shockingly, Herod, the king of the Jews, is kind of put in the place of Nebuchadnezzar. He's a bad guy. So therefore, what Herod is doing with the boys in Bethlehem is equated with what Nebuchadnezzar was doing with the men of Judah when he took them into exile. Okay, so it's like that. It's a typology. It's not a prediction necessarily, but it's a typology. And then it goes through the rest of them. The last one, it was the trick question in your assignment, is when Jesus returns and he settles in Nazareth. Matthew says this is what was fulfilled in the prophets. He will be called a Nazarene. Well, there's no Old Testament verse that says that. It's a wordplay, probably either on Judges 13 about Samson being a Nazarite, because the word Nazareth in Hebrew, the word for Nazarite, Nazareth, it sounds similar, but it's more specifically, it's probably more a relation to Isaiah 11, which is the Hebrew word for branch, Nazir. And when you look at Isaiah 11, that is a prophecy about a coming Messiah, okay? A king of Israel who would be faithful, kind of like Hezekiah, that God would use to free his people. And so when you go through, every time you go through, if you're reading through Matthew, anytime you get to a passage where he says, thus was fulfilled this Old Testament passage, take the time to go back to that original Old Testament passage, look in a study Bible, try to figure out the original context. And that original context will then enlighten you how to interpret what he's trying to say with Jesus. I'll give you one more example that you haven't looked at yet. I can't remember where it is. It's in one of the Gospels, where Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's from Psalm 22. It's the first line of Psalm 22. Now, if you're like me growing up, that was always said to be, that's at the point when Jesus was on the cross, when God turned his back because he couldn't see the sin on Jesus, that kind of thing. Well, when you look at Psalm 22, it's a psalm that begins in despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then throughout the Psalm 22, the speaker is thinking back to the times when God did save his people. He didn't forsake his people. And by the end of the psalm, you realize that God hasn't forsaken the speaker, and that the speaker is now singing God's praises in the midst of the assembly because God hasn't forsaken him. When you realize the full context of Psalm 22, then when you look at Jesus on the cross saying that, it becomes more clear. The way I put it, it's kind of simplistic. I read it as God, as Jesus basically saying to the people who think God has forsaken him because he's on the cross, him saying, get back to me in 3 days because I know God isn't going to forsake me. So it's the exact opposite of what you might generally think. Okay, so that's a quick word about how Matthew uses Old Testament prophecy. The second thing I want to emphasize is the temple stuff. You have to realize when you read, and you'll see this in Luke as well, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem on the donkey, everything is screaming, he's the Messiah, and from the Jewish expectation, he is going to overthrow Rome, cleanse the temple, and set up the kingdom of Israel as the true kingdom of God. And everything he does once he gets to the temple is opposite. He overturns not just the tables, but their whole expectations of what he's doing. When he comes into Jerusalem, they're singing a section of Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The Jews there think he's the Messiah, he's the coming king who's going to fight Rome. Instead, what he does, and cleanse the temple. Instead, what he does, he goes to the temple. He doesn't start a fight with Rome. In fact, if you read the full context, when they ask him whether that they should pay taxes to Caesar, he basically says, yeah. But what he does, the shocker, is when he overturns the tables and stuff. He doesn't cleanse the temple. He pronounces judgment on it. That's why when he quotes the Isaiah passage in Jeremiah 7:11, Jeremiah was a prophet known for prophesying about the destruction of Solomon's temple. That's what Jesus is doing. He is saying, and this is the connection with the fig tree, he is going to Jerusalem, going to the temple, and he's attacking the temple establishment. They are the problem. The temple, like the fig tree, was supposed to bear fruit, bear fruit for God and be fruitful for righteousness and all that stuff for his people. But instead, what they had done is they had made the temple a nationalistic symbol to kind of give a middle finger to Rome. And Jesus is basically telling them, because you've done that, because the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and you've made it into a hideout for robbers, or the actual word should be revolutionaries. Because of that, he's saying it's going to be destroyed. In fact, in the context of the passage, as well as when you realize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written right around 70 AD, when Rome came in and destroyed the temple, that takes on a whole new meaning. Now, when he does that, you have to realize, why did they crucify him? That's why. He's claiming to be the Messiah, and he's coming in, and he's throwing the gauntlet down by challenging the temple establishment. That's why it's the temple establishment who go in the middle of the night to arrest him. Get out of your head this idea that Roman soldiers came to arrest Jesus. They didn't. It was the temple police, basically, who went out, arrested him. When you look at the trial before the Sanhedrin, what are they concerned about? You're claiming to be the Messiah, and you're speaking against the temple. That's what gets him killed. Now, the trick is they want him dead because he's a threat to their power, but they need Rome's help to execute him because Rome has the power for capital punishment. So what they do in the Pilate's trial, when they take Jesus to Pilate the next morning, notice how they don't accuse Jesus of the things they are concerned about. Oh, he's speaking against the temple. They tell Pilate that he claims to be a king. And as Pilate's concerned, if somebody claims to be a king, they're a threat to Caesar, and that's what gets him killed. So that's the dynamic of what led to Jesus' crucifixion. Now, there's obviously a whole lot more, but if you realize that's the historical context that led to his being crucified, as well as how Matthew uses the Old Testament in his gospel, if you read through the whole thing, a lot more will make more sense. And I just wanted to cover that to make sure you're clear on that, because it really is key to understanding not just Matthew, but Mark and Luke as well. So keep working on your Luke stuff, and I'll grade it when it comes in.